all the apostles had the keys and Peter really wasn't that special. They try to downplay the importance of Peter because they're concluding that if Peter's important, that means the Pope's important. It's like if you've made that parallel between Peter and the Pope, you've kind of already lost.
Yes, there's beauty in the liturgy. Yes, there's community. Yes, I feel more involved. When did you start to feel like I can't stay here?
And I just kept coming back to the issue of the papacy. But now we're being told by the Orthodox that every member of the Episcopal College is Peter, which would mean that every member of the Episcopal College is the head of the Episcopal College, which at that point, it's like, what does headship even mean? Like, it's like that line from The Incredibles, right? If everyone is super, no one is, you know, like if everyone's the head, no one is. You know, if everyone is Peter, nobody's Peter. You know, the Western error is precisely in trying to be precise, whereas the Eastern has always been more mystical. It's like, I'm sorry, have you ever read the Ecumenical Councils? Did you read some of these Christological disputes between St. Cyril and Nestorius? It's the most precise technical thing I've ever read in my life. Every group that broke off from the Catholic Church has just kind of been forever fixed in the era in which they broke off.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Roots Apostolic. I am very excited for today's episode. I have been wanting to speak to this individual for quite some time. I've been watching his videos. I've been reading his articles. This person has inspired me a lot in my own faith journey, you know, as I discern between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. So without further ado, welcome Ben Bollinger. How are you doing today, brother?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm doing pretty good today. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. I'm doing good. Like I said in the intro, I've been looking forward to this episode. I've been binging your videos. I'm the type of person that I have to watch the same things over and over again just to like internalize even just a little bit of information.
Yeah.
And your videos are like jam-packed with so much facts and details and church history. And I'm just like, I just have to keep watching them. And I'm just learning something new every single time. So it's very exciting. But before we get into this episode, this whole episode, I want to talk about your testimony, your journey into the faith, into the Catholic Church. You have a very interesting journey, and I want to dive really deep into it today. Start us off with, how did you become Catholic? You know, take us all the way back to the beginning. Were you always Catholic? What has your journey been like?
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for the high praise. I hope that I am worthy of it. That's very, very kind. But yeah, my journey. Well, all started the day I was born. Well, not exactly. It started 2 months after I was born. I was baptized into the Lutheran Church I believe I was 2 months old. I had to go back when I joined the Catholic Church. I had to get all my stuff in order to make sure I was actually baptized and confirmed and whatnot. And so yeah, I was baptized as a Lutheran, and I was kind of brought up in I would describe us as like a nominally Lutheran household. You know, like we would, like when I was like a little kid, we would go to church pretty much every Sunday. But that was probably because my sister and I attended the preschool at the church. And so it was probably more of like a social dynamic, because as I grew older, we kind of stopped going as frequently. We kind of became more Christmas and Easter kind of Lutherans. But I mean, the faith was like important in certain ways to my parents. Like they really, I know that they really like believed, and it was important for them that we believed. But it really wasn't, I don't know, it didn't go super deep. Like it was just kind of like, you know, you have to believe in God, believe in Christ, believe in the Bible, but we're not going to really dive into what that actually means. It's kind of just like this nominal affirmation that you make because it's what good people do, and you want to be a good person. So good people believe in God, right? So that's kind of what my faith was as a kid. Though I know my mom always tells me that I was very like spiritually in tune as a child. Like I don't have many memories of this, but she said when I was like a little kid, I would say like crazy things about like God and heaven. She's like, how do you know about this stuff? And she always thought I would like grow up to be a pastor because of that or something like that. So it was very surprising for her when I became an atheist when I was in around middle school, kind of like middle school going into high school. And I remember exactly how it happened too. I was on the middle school bus going to like it was like the first week of middle school. And I sat next to this kid who was in my class, and he was an atheist. And I didn't even really know what that was at the time. Like, this is how, like, out of tune I was with things. I mean, I'm in middle school, you know, cut me a little slack there.
Right.
But I sat down next to him on the bus, and he just starts like grilling me. I'm like, why do you believe in God? Like, do you know that there's no evidence for God? Like, what about science? What about evolution? You know, because my dad is a botanist, so I also grew up like very much immersed in like the sciences. Loved the series Cosmos by Neil deGrasse Tyson. I know Carl Sagan did the initial one. I didn't watch that one. I did the redoing of it by Neil deGrasse Tyson. I loved that when I was a kid. So I was at first very defensive, like, you know, God has to be real, you know, surely. But then, like, the more I thought about it, the more I was like, I don't actually have any good reasons to believe this. And all the stuff
Mm,
he's saying about like science and stuff like that makes sense. Then he introduced me to kind of like the new atheist YouTubers, like the Amazing Atheist, for anyone who remembers that guy. I think he's still on YouTube doing stuff. I don't know. But kind of like, you know, it's like the 2010s. So it's kind of like the new atheist movement, you know, kind of like that post 9/11, like anti religion movement that started in America. Is kind of reaching its like heyday on YouTube, and I'm very much getting swept up in that. And you know, I think there was a combination of factors that led to that. You know, on the one hand, obviously, I didn't get a very good formation; like I was not taught why we believe these things. The faith was not seriously imitated for me. Like I remember even as a kid having the thought about like, you know, we're going to go from talking about God once a week on Sundays to like eternity. It's just going to be God forever and ever. I'm like that there's some kind of problem with that. Like as a kid, I couldn't quite put that to words, but that always like struck me like there's something not right about that, and it didn't make sense to me. So I didn't have that formation, but I think it was also a movement of pride on my part as well, like because
mm,
I didn't really, you know, fit in. I don't know if anybody really fits in middle school, but I certainly didn't. I like didn't. I had a kind of a hard time like socializing, and so being an atheist was kind of like a prideful way to be on like an in crowd, be like, oh yeah, all these people, they're religious, but I have like, it's almost like a Gnostic thing. Like I have this like secret knowledge that, you know, God really
mm.
doesn't exist. It's kind of a way to make myself, to make me feel better about myself, to make me feel like I am somehow like intellectually superior to others. And that kind of began like a, you know, a long struggle with like arrogance and intellectual pride, that really goes even until today, you know, still have my struggles with it, though I do believe I've come a long way with it. Um, and so yeah, so that was by the time I get to middle school, going into high school, I'm like a full-fledged atheist. I'm on. I don't know if anyone remembers iFunny. It was like a social media platform back in
Yeah.
the day. I had an atheist iFunny account that had like over 1,000 subscribers, and I would post just like really silly atheist memes about like, you know, do you know that the Bible says this? And like, you know, God doesn't really exist. What about the flying spaghetti monster? Like that was literally that was me.
Right.
Um, and and then when I get to high school, I end up just like burning out on it. I'm like, I honestly don't even find this interesting anymore. Like I feel like I've successfully debunked religion. You know, it's just boring to me at this point. And so I decided to move on to politics. And so I get like very swept up. This is like around like the 2016 election. So like a lot of people are kind of having political awakenings, so to speak, during this time.
Right.
And so I was very, and I was like all over the place. Like I was on like Instagram, we call it Politigram. Like there were all these like political accounts on Instagram. And at first I was like a hardcore libertarian, you know, like anarcho-capitalist, if anyone knows what that is, you know, don't recommend looking into it. I don't know. It's, it's an interesting worldview. But then I became like a hardcore Marxist after that. And so I was like very into like the Marxist world. Even actually, but the YouTube channel that I currently have was originally a Marxist YouTube channel. And there's actually still videos of me as like a Marxist. I have them privated, obviously.
That's
But I,
crazy.
yeah, no, I start the video like "Hello, comrades," like unironically, so seriously.
That's
It's
so
so
funny.
cringy. Let's talk about Marxist economic theory and all this stuff. That was me in high school, and around the time I was in high school, I had my first like, you know, I was like a very like online, like didn't have really any friends, but I had my first like romantic experience in high school that kind of went not great. And I had my first like real encounter with like heartbreak, and I was, and which like, you know, there's a lot worse things that could happen to somebody. But for me, it was like one of the worst things that had ever happened to me personally in my life.
Mm,
And so it was like, so I experienced it, I think, a lot more intensely than perhaps was actually warranted for what it was. But I experienced this profound sense of like heartbreak, and it just like sent me into this like spiral of like depression that lasted for pretty much like an entire year. I like couldn't think about anything else. I was just like thinking about this whole situation that happened. And it was in the midst of that that I noticed a lot of people who were kind of in the political online world were starting to become Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, like from all stripes. Like I know people who were like anarcho-capitalist conservative people who became Catholic and Orthodox. I know someone who was a fellow Marxist writer who also became a Catholic. So it seemed to be like a movement that was sweeping all across, and so I was naturally very interested in it. And my YouTube feed started to like recommend some videos that were trending in this direction. So I remember I watched like one video about the Book of Deuteronomy, and I think it was the first like video I watched that was about the Bible, but that was not like making fun of the Bible. That was actually like taking the Bible seriously. And I don't remember anything of what that video was even about, like even the exact text from Deuteronomy that it was about. But that struck me, just the idea that there was like somebody relatively close to my age who was taking the Bible seriously. That kind of stuck with me. And then I came across a video by Classical Theist, whom some people might know on YouTube because he's still active on YouTube and Twitter, or X, I think. And it was called An Argument for the Existence of God. And the video was 30 minutes long. And so I decided to watch the video, and I watched the video, and it's going through St. Thomas Aquinas's argument from motion for the existence of God. And the video just flies over my head. I like don't understand a word that he said, and that like intrigues me. I'm like, maybe there's a lot more to this whole theology, philosophy stuff than I thought. And so he recommended another video by a YouTuber named Mathema, who's not really as much on the scene anymore. He kind of was back in the day, like 6, 7 years ago. Talk about it like I'm like 50 years old, not quite. But he made like another video. That one, like I don't know, maybe it had better graphics. I don't know what it was, but for whatever reason, I like could understand that video better than Classical Theists, and I felt like I actually comprehended the argument from motion and the argument from contingency. And Mathema was, in particular, he was like making these arguments in dialogue with like new atheist writers that I was familiar with, like Richard Dawkins and a couple others I can't quite remember. And so that particularly spoke to me because, as I mentioned, that was kind of like the environment in which my atheism first reared its head, was that new atheist environment. And so to see that the new atheist writers just completely misunderstood classical theology and philosophy, which even like the best of atheist philosophers today will admit that like the new atheist movement was not representative of the best that atheism had to offer. And so that just particularly stuck with me personally. And then Classical Theist and Mathema, they're both Catholics, by the way. I should mention that. Obviously, going from St. Thomas Aquinas, you would not that you don't necessarily have to be Catholic to use St. Thomas Aquinas to argue, but most of the time you either are Catholic or you'll eventually become Catholic if you do that.
Right.
And so they do a collaboration video together where they're going through how, you can't obviously demonstrate the Catholic faith philosophically. Like that would collapse the distinction between faith and reason and nature and grace and all this stuff. However, you can show the fittingness of Catholic doctrines like the incarnation, the sacraments, the nature of like an institutional church. You can kind of show the fittingness of that from certain philosophical arguments. And I don't remember the exact arguments they were making. I mean, it's been a long time since I saw that video, but whatever they said in that video like really resonated with me, and I was like, wow, like the Catholic faith really seems very like strong, like has like this philosophical tradition, it has like this fittingness theologically. And then I was also introduced to Catholic biblical scholars like Dr. Brant Petrie, Dr. Scott Hahn, Dr. John Bergsma, and I got a book. It was called A Catholic Introduction to the Bible, the Old Testament, by John Bergsma, Brant Petrie, and I read through about like half. It's like a 1,000-page like intense. It's like supposed to be like a textbook, and I like read through half of it in like the course of like 6 months, and it was my first like real immersion into the biblical text, and I fell in love with sacred scripture. I remember in particular watching Dr. Brant Petrie's video going over the typology between the sacrifice of Isaac and the sacrifice of Christ, like an only beloved son carrying his own sacrificial wood up a mountain in Jerusalem, and offering himself as Isaac does, because Isaac is a young man and he could have resisted his father if he wanted to, but he did not. He offered himself just as our Lord does. And just seeing that, like those parallels, and the more I learned about it, the deeper down the parallels, and the symbolism goes. I just fell in love with it, and I'm like, all this is coming from the Catholic tradition, so I really want
Right.
to become Catholic. I also I like find Catholic answers. I find like like the Steve Ray apologists, kind of like the original like the 90s like critiques of Protestantism, and I'm like just
Hmm.
just eating it all up like, oh yeah, like this makes a lot of sense. I like legitimately could not understand why anyone would be Protestant. I'm like, it's so obviously false, like I as if I know everything, right? But that was like my perception at the time. Like, wow, like reading all this stuff from these Catholic apologists, I became very convinced of it. And so this is like 2017, 2018. Like 2018 is where a lot of this is happening. And so I decided like, okay, this is very intellectual. This is all like online. So I have to actually like do something about it. Like unlike my politics where I could just kind of keep it online and just live in my own world, pontificating about
Hmm.
it. The church doesn't let you do that. You have to actually go somewhere in person and live out your beliefs. And I'm like, okay, I understood that enough. And then eventually I work up the courage to actually like go to mass. Cause, once again, I'm in high school at this point. I'm very socially awkward. I like don't like going out of my comfort zone. So I like have to like force myself to just go to the local parish. And I will say actually, it's just kind of like a kind of, run of the mill Novus Ordo parish that I have just down the street. My first impression of that parish was this is like one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. Like that was actually, even though like I now go there and I don't have that impression because I've since like refined my tastes. But I think it just goes to show like that's how distorted my sense of like beauty and holiness was like just like a simple church was enough to like, compel me like, wow, there's something beautiful here. So actually that was like my initial impression of that parish was like, wow, this is actually very beautiful. And I went to the mass and there were like certain aspects of it that kind of like rubbed me the wrong way. Like I could tell like oh I don't know like what's going on. Like I had never been raised Catholic. I think I'd been to like one or two Catholic masses before because I had cousins who were Catholic and they got confirmed, and I think I attended those masses. But I had no idea what was going on. I was very confused, and ultimately like I show up. I don't really know what I expect to happen, like nobody comes up to me, nobody introduces themselves, and I'm just like, oh, okay, like I guess I'm just gonna leave now, like I had no idea what to expect. Eventually, I contact the deacon at this parish, and he tells me about RCIA. I also, of course, because I'm a young Catholic inquirer, I'm also like, I definitely want to become a priest too. Like obviously, that's what you
Hmm.
have to do.
Go
And so
all
he
the
tells
way.
seminary, and that they actually had a parishioner there who was a seminarian, who I later met, and he's since become a good friend. But it took me like several years to actually meet this person that he was talking about. It was a little foreshadowing. Kind of funny how that worked out. But eventually, he invites me to like go to like a youth ministry thing, but I'm like not really comfortable around my peers at this point, so I just don't feel comfortable doing that. And so yeah, I just kind of like I go to mass. It's just kind of like a thing I do on Sundays. I read a lot about the faith, write about it online, but it didn't like take in my soul. Um, and it's at this point that I've come across the blog of someone named Eric Ybarra, whom many of your listeners are probably familiar with. He does a lot of apologetic discourse with the Eastern Orthodox. And so I came across his blog, and I think it was his blog that largely introduced me to Eastern Orthodoxy because I kind of like heard about it because, like I said, a lot of people in the political sphere, they were becoming Catholic or Orthodox, but I hadn't really investigated Eastern Orthodoxy. But I read like he had like an article exchange with Craig Trulia about like the filioque and the papacy. This is going back to like 2018, and I was like very interested. I was like, oh, okay, so like I don't necessarily have to become Catholic. Like there's other like I don't have to become. Obviously, I can't become a Protestant because who would want to be a Protestant, right? I At that point I was like Protestantism. I'm not even going to consider it. But I'm like, but I also don't have to be Catholic. Like there's also these Eastern Orthodox. And I'll be honest, when I looked into their arguments, I mean, I found them like kind of compelling initially. I think it was more so just like, when you have like a certain conviction and then you see that there's an intelligent person who has the opposite conviction, there's like an immediate like, oh no, like reaction, like
Right.
you immediately give credence to it, even if like you haven't even had more than like, an hour to fully process what they just said. So I think I kind of had like that initial like shock of like, oh, I really got to take this very seriously, which obviously, people should take it seriously. Um,
Right.
but the more I like read these exchanges between Eric and like Craig Trulia, there's also someone named Alora who had a blog called Shameless Orthodoxy. I actually don't even know if it was a man or a woman who ran the blog, kind of a gender ambiguous name, and I don't know that they're still active, but I was reading a lot of like the exchanges that were happening in like the blogosphere WordPress world is where all this stuff was living. I know now it's all like Substack and stuff like that, but it was
Right.
WordPress in this era. And I'm really not impressed, to be honest, with a lot of the Orthodox responses to the Catholic arguments, especially for the papacy. I mean, I like because I came across Eric Ibarra's stuff early, I had like an initial like really good papal apologetic, like just seeing, you know, Matthew 16, Christ appoints St. Peter as head over the apostles. And so if you're going to have a doctrine like apostolic succession, it doesn't make sense to not have a successor for the head of the apostolic college. I just kind of, I'll definitely go more into that argument as we go on. But just
Right.
kind of like that intuition of like, yeah, the apostles had one, divinely appointed head. It's not as if they like all came together and voted who they want the chief apostle to be. It's like, no, Christ chose one of them, and the authority that they all exercise collectively, he exercises personally. And it's like, yeah, maybe you don't just immediately get every single Vatican I doctrine, but you can clearly see how it gets articulated. I remember also seeing the witness of Philip the Legate at the Third Ecumenical Council, where he gives that testimony about the church being built on St. Peter and his successor, and Peter living and reigning in his successors down even to today and forever. And those successors are in the Church of Rome. And I remember just like seeing them, like, yeah, this seems really clear to me that
Right.
this is like really Catholic. And then the Orthodox that I was reading came back with like, well, all the apostles have the keys, and Peter's not really the rock. And I'm just like, that's not really like a great argument. Which there are better Orthodox arguments than that.
Very
That I
anti-biblical as well.
exactly, yeah. But like that was like all I was getting, and I'm like, this is not great. But keep in mind, like this is concurrent with my like just kind of disillusionment with like the local parish. And then of course there's like all like the obviously like the sex abuse scandal breaks out in 2018, which I was not super in tune with that. I remember I went to a Byzantine Catholic parish, and during the homily, the priest like took a vase and he like shattered it in the middle of church as like an example to show like what the sex abuse scandal meant. It didn't register with me what he was doing because I was not really paying
Mm.
attention. Um, but kind of just like, yeah, like the idea that there's all this like corruption in the Catholic Church, learning about like Vatican II and like, all these like changes that happened. And then here are the Orthodox over here saying like, look, we're actually the unchanged tradition, and then I just kind of like, I'm like, okay, I have to like give it a shot. And so in kind of like my desperation, because I can't find like good community, I can't like my prayer life is not sticking, my spiritual life is not really great. I'm like, I need to do something. So I reach out to a bunch of Orthodox priests in my area, and I'm just like, hey, I just want to talk. I'm not really necessarily thinking I'm going to become Orthodox. Though I think my impetus for doing that was I came across the Orthodox critique of the doctrine of original sin, and I thought that was like really profound. Though I later came, even as an Orthodox Christian, I'm like, actually, no, this isn't that great. But that was kind of like my initial impetus of like, whoa, there's like a whole different vibe. Maybe there's like a whole stuff I'm not, considering. And so I met with the man who would become my own Orthodox priest. I remember the first meeting that we had. I had my Saint Benedict crucifix on when I went to go meet with him, and I was like, no, I was like, I had the conscious thought, I'm like, I am not going to become Orthodox. Like, I am
Yeah.
not convinced of this. But when I went to meet with him, his wife greeted me at the door, and it was like the most hospitable interaction I'd had in the
Mm.
Christian world to date. At that point. Um, and that just like that stuck with me more than anything that the priest himself said. In fact, the things that he said, I like was like, okay, this seems a little like esoteric and not very concrete, and I'm like very like intellectual, like I want to like pin things down. And obviously, anyone who's experienced orthodoxy at the parish level knows that's generally not what happens in
Right.
theological discourse, and that kind of like turned me off. But then he invited me to come to the liturgy, and I was very hesitant at first because I had had a poor experience in the Eastern Catholic liturgy because of the way I was kind of treated in that community. I just kind of like was treated like an outsider, and people were not very kind to me, and so I was very hesitant to
Mm.
like go to an Eastern tradition. But then like a week goes by, and then I go like the following week, and they sit me next to a catechumen, which actually it's funny. My priest wife said, "Go sit next to him. He's a catechumen." I had no idea what that word meant. I did not like. I'm like, okay, I don't know what that means. Or maybe they explained it and said that it's like, oh, he's like preparing. I don't know. But anyways, I sit next to this catechumen, and they have like these binders that like take you through the liturgy, and he like shows me like step by step like what every part is, like what to do, what to sing, and I felt like very included. I felt very seen.
Mhm.
And obviously the liturgy itself, I mean, anyone who's been to a Byzantine liturgy, it's very beautiful. Certainly, like it's very
Right.
exteriorly beautiful, especially in ways that like the Roman Rite has always been more kind of less sensible. It became more sensible over time, but the Byzantines have always been a little bit more sensible and I guess extravagant, which I do not say as like a bad thing. That's just there's just differences.
Right.
And so certainly somebody who had like no experience like that to like now being like immersed in this like beautiful liturgical world, and also that parish in particular had like professional singers, like former opera singers, someone who like studied at Juilliard, like the best music that I really have ever experienced. Even in the Orthodox world, I think that was still the best music I'd ever experienced every single week. Like it wasn't just like a special time. Like those were literally just the people at the parish. We didn't like hire a choir or something like that. So it was just like such a profound experience, and of course the people were super friendly. I loved the people, loved the community. I still wasn't sold on the theology, but I was just kind of with the mindset of like, at this point, I don't even want to become Catholic. Like, I just want to join this community. I want to be a part of this, and I'm like, I think I can kind of force myself around some of the Catholic arguments, and I discover Father Laurent Kleinwork's book called His Broken Body, and in that book, I guess I get presented with a more sophisticated Orthodox critique of Catholicism from
Mhm.
the ecclesiological perspective, where, Father Laurent, he's not trying to say, like, oh, look, all the apostles had the keys and Peter really wasn't that special. Which is kind of funny because that line of argument almost, in a sense, like proves the Catholic, like line of like, if you like, they try to downplay the importance of Peter because they're concluding that if Peter's important, that means the Pope's important. It's like if
Right.
you've that parallel between Peter and the Pope, you've kind of already lost. you
Simplistic.
know,
Yeah.
and so I was kind of like seeing that. So I'm like, okay, like you have to attack that like parallel between Peter and the Pope, like to begin with. You can't just like assume it, but then try to downplay Peter. Like that's the wrong approach.
Right.
So he kind of takes the approach that, well, all the bishops are Saint Peter, and he ties this to the ecclesiology of Saint Cyprian of Carthage, who did have a notion that all the bishops are the successors of Peter. Like in terms of their local diocese, they're the key bearers over their diocese. The priests in relation to them are like Peter and over the apostles and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And that is essentially the model that the Orthodox uphold. Is that we have the successors of Peter in all of the episcopate, and yeah, that was enough intellectually for me. I'm like, okay, yeah, I can make that work. I don't have to like dismiss Matthew 16. I don't have to dismiss like the parallels I saw clearly with like Isaiah 22 and stuff like that. I'm like, no, I can accept all this. I can just apply it to every bishop, and I can kind of like read a lot of this like first millennium Petrine language as maybe applying to every bishop. And, there's also the concept of like the three Petrine sees: Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch,
Right.
and kind of like shoehorn that in. And then most decisive for my Orthodox like journey was my discovery of Seraphim Hamilton, who you actually interviewed, I believe, a
Mhm.
while ago. And
Right.
his writings, he's like a biblical theologian. His writings just like completely rocked my world. Not particularly about like Catholic Orthodox relations, but just like his whole like biblical worldview. He's very influenced by guys like James Jordan and Peter Leithart, who know those guys. They're like Reformed theologians, but they're very like lowercase c Catholic, in a lot of their ideas. Though James Jordan less so. Don't read anything he says about church history; it's all kind of nonsense. But Peter Leithart is more of a nuanced thinker. But yeah, so Seraphim Hamilton like just introduced me to this radical new way of reading the Bible. Just seeing Christ all over Scripture, and so he also naturally had a reading of Saint Peter's relation to the episcopacy that was like something I could like grasp onto. And he eventually became like actually a personal friend and mentor to me. That we've since not really had many interactions in recent history, but I actually got to meet him in person as well. A very, very, very
Mhm.
great guy. And
Yeah.
so yeah, that was kind of my journey into the Orthodox Church. I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything, or you want me to just I can keep going and talk about my
Yeah, just real quick, what did you see in the Catholic Church originally that made you feel disillusioned by it? Was it the liturgy? Was it the way that it was done in the Novus Ordo? Or what was it initially that you were like, there's kind of like this disconnect between what I'm reading and then what I'm actually experiencing in the everyday life as a Catholic?
it's hard for me to remember because like I was experiencing that before I had any of the categories for like the liturgy wars, So like I wasn't like noticing like, oh look, they're receiving communion on the hand, they're like extraordinary ministers. Like I didn't even know what any of that stuff was. Like
Right.
I'm just like looking at this stuff, and I guess what I notice is like the way people are dressed is very casual. Like I see people in shorts and like Hawaiian shirts and
Football
flip flops.
jerseys and yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like, so that kind of rubs me the wrong way. And then just like the tackiness of the music as well, I would say, where it kind of felt like we were in Mass the musical. Is kind of how I
Yeah.
jokingly refer to it, and like the way like the readings are done, like we're in kindergarten. Like, and then they were all destroyed. The word of the Lord. It's like,
Yeah.
like maybe like have a different diction when you're speaking the word of God. It was just kind of like aesthetic things like that. And I did go to a Tridentine Mass at St. John Cantius Parish in Chicago. But the problem with that was I didn't have anyone to show me how to follow along with it. I couldn't really appreciate
Right.
it. I didn't really know what was happening. So like that was kind of like my experience. Like either you get like this super like relaxed, nobody really seems to be taking it seriously, and tacky music. And even like the super traditional one, it's like kind of incomprehensible and I can't follow what's going on. So that was kind of my experiential perception of Catholicism.
Yeah, that makes sense. I attended a Novus Ordo yesterday, and I had, I had similar insights and observations. Like, I really feel like what the Orthodox do correctly is they engage all of the senses in the
Yeah.
worship, and it really feels like you're participating in the liturgy. Whereas
Mm,
many Novus Ordo parishes, I won't say all of them, but many of them, you feel more so like a spectator. You're sitting
yes.
down, you just kind of let it happen. You just let it take place, and you're watching something happen versus, going to the divine liturgy, you're doing the sign of the cross many times. You're just taking you're taking everything in, the incense, the iconography. So I can see how that is very compelling. But when did you start to see that this isn't going to be enough for me? Like, yes,
Mm,
there's beauty in the liturgy. Yes, there is community. Yes, I feel more involved. Yes, I feel more, like I'm included in something. When did you start to feel like I can't stay here?
yeah. I would say that there were various points. I mean, as you can tell, just based on how I described that, like I always had a heart for Catholicism and for like St. Thomas Aquinas in the Latin tradition. And that didn't just like go away the second I became Orthodox. And so there was
Right.
like always a lingering thought in the back of my mind of like, what about Catholicism? So that like thought, like the idea that I should become Catholic never really went away when like during the whole time I was in the Orthodox Church. It was certainly more pronounced. I'd say the first time it got like really exacerbated was during COVID, during the lockdowns, when I got
Mm,
like kind of shut off from my parish for a while. We did reopen very quickly, much quicker than I'm sure like many Catholic parishes around us did. Um, but I was like very like kind of swept up in the COVID ideology, and like I was like I think I should just stay. Like I was very not handling it very well. But one of the things that forced me to do is like it kind of brought me back to okay, but what are how are you going to practice the faith? When you're on your own. Like what is your like when I'm not involved with like the community, like I don't have the community to rely on. I don't have that beautiful liturgy to rely on. It's just kind of like me and the faith, and it's like do I actually believe this when I have time kind of apart from that experience to like reflect on this and consider this and bring it to the Lord in prayer and things like that. And I just kept coming back to the issue of the papacy and like all these, especially like it was a lot of like the quote mines that people like sometimes dismiss. Like texts like Pope Saint Agatha's letter to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, Hadrian's letter to the Seventh Ecumenical Council, or like we mentioned,
right.
Philip's profession of faith before the Third Ecumenical Council. I mean, the more I would read those, especially like considering their historical contexts as well, the more I'm like, I feel like this is just more resonant with Catholic theology than with Orthodox theology. So I would like read like to see what do Orthodox apologists have to say about this. I mean, Father Laurent Klingberg, for his part, just straight up admits like, yeah, the Eastern churches agreed to like papal supremacy before the schism. Their mistake. Like some
Right.
scholars are just honest with that about that, and which obviously I'm not saying that like every jot and tittle of Vatican I is present in these documents, but then I started developing a closer friendship with Eric Ibarra, and so him and I had like a lot of conversations about the papacy, and something that he like really pointed out to me is like you don't need to have every jot and tittle of Vatican I in the first millennium in order to
Right.
negate Eastern Orthodoxy, which perhaps we could
Hmm.
distinguish that from necessarily proving Catholicism, right? But certainly, if you have in the first millennium this idea that Peter is the supreme, is the, I won't use that word supreme. He is the divinely appointed head of the apostles, right? And that the apostolic college, right, the college of apostles considered as a whole, has its successor in the episcopal college, right? And so if there is going to be a Petrine successor at all, right, whatever he is, he has to be, right, just as Peter is, appointed by Christ over the apostles, that successor to Peter has to be similarly appointed by Christ to be over the episcopate. And then, I mean, even just that question alone, like, does Eastern Orthodoxy have something like that, where you have a divinely instituted ruler over the college of bishops? However you want to understand the limits of that, that headship or whatever, the answer is no. Like, nobody in the Orthodox Church even claims to be that. Like, even if you read the most, like, pro ecumenical patriarch statements coming out of the Fanar, which, for those who don't know, the ecumenical patriarch, he's the patriarch of Constantinople, whom some Orthodox regard as having inherited the position of Rome after the schism, right? That just as Rome was this
Right.
kind of like first among equals before the schism, now the ecumenical patriarch, because he's new Rome and he was second in ranking, he now inherits that position that Rome had. But something I've never seen from an ecumenical patriarch is him claiming to be the divinely appointed successor of Peter, the one on whom the foundations of the church were laid, that he has the keys of the kingdom, and that this is the basis upon which he can depose patriarchs, which is something that is said directly before the schism, both by Pope St. Nicholas I and by Pope John VIII to Photius of Constantinople. And John VIII in particular, when his legates said that to Photius and the Council of Constantinople 879, they did not contradict him. I'm not saying that clearly they acted contrary to that, like the fact that Photius resisted those initiatives.
Right.
But they never challenged that on theological grounds. Instead, they just accepted, at face value. They might have like minor quibbles with it, but the idea that you have a pope making these grand claims in the first millennium, and Pope St. Nicholas certainly was not the first to make these kinds of claims, that just stuck with me, because I'm like, there's no one in the Orthodox world who even makes these claims. The ecumenical patriarch doesn't make these claims, and it's like, as much as you want to say, like, oh, well, the churches of Alexandria and Antioch have this Petrine inheritance, I also came to see how that kind of just misunderstands the logic of Petrine succession, because
Right.
the whole idea is that Peter needs a successor only after he dies. Like, when Peter's still alive, he doesn't need a successor. So it doesn't matter if Peter's in Antioch, if he's in Alexandria, he could be, in Bohemia for all we care. Like, he doesn't need a successor as long as he's on earth. It's only when he dies that he needs a successor, right? And so that naturally means that the place where he dies is going to have a claim to being his successor, whereas, places that he merely happened to be at different points are not going to have that claim, because he was in a lot of different places. He was also in Jerusalem, you know. And
Right.
yet we don't say that Jerusalem is this, has this claim to being a Petrine successor.
Would it be fair to say that, because this is what I've been saying, but if I'm wrong, please correct me. Would it be fair to say that Antioch and Alexandria, they are Petrine sees, they do have successors of St. Peter, but they don't have successors of his unique office? Would it be fair to say that?
It all comes down to, like, what do we mean by a successor of Peter? Because in the direct sense, I mean, for example, when we say that someone is a successor of the apostles, right? What do we mean by this? We mean that they exercise the same ministry in relation to the church that the apostles exercised. Because obviously, even at that, we have to make a distinction between prerogatives that were unique to the apostles versus prerogatives that were, able to be passed down to their successors. So an example of a prerogative that was unique to the apostles is obviously divine inspiration and infallibility, right? That was a gift that was not even just limited to the apostles. I mean, you have literal prophets in the New Testament. Like, there's many references to New Testament prophets who receive revelations. You see this all throughout the book of Acts, people getting visions, receiving revelations, and that's like
Right.
binding divine revelation, right? This is new revelation. Like, they could hypothetically reveal a new doctrine, right? Not saying the apostles were always doing that, but certainly at times they were doing that. And that's obviously not a gift that gets passed down to the successor of the apostles. However, a gift that does is, for example, the power of the keys, right? What is the
Mhm.
power of the keys? Binding and loosing. Matthew 18 explains this quite well. It's the power of including or excluding people from the community, right? as Christ says, right? If somebody you have a dispute with a brother, take it up individually. If you disagree, take it to the church. And if they don't listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector, right? Let him be excommunicated. And he explains that with the binding and loosing passage. So the binding and loosing is the authority of excommunication. This is an authority that Paul is going to invoke in 1 Corinthians 5 in language that actually sounds somewhat similar to Matthew 16, because he references handing someone over to Satan. And so the idea of binding and loosing in the context of the gates of hell is kind of interesting to read in light of that. And so
Right.
obviously, most Christians who are, worth their weight or whatever, are going to say that excommunication is something that continues in the church. It's not as if the church lost the ability to exclude people from the community the second the apostles die. Instead, that power of the keys has to continue. So there has to be some kind of succession, right? That the authority that was given just to the apostles, because we also don't want to say that every individual has the ability to excommunicate. Like, Susan on parish council just declares you excommunicate in anathema. Clearly that's not the case.
Right.
There are certain prerogatives that are passed down, and that's what we call an apostolic successor, because they share those same prerogatives that were unique to the apostolic college, right? And so when we talk about a Petrine successor, we have to talk in a similar capacity. That it is someone who shares the prerogatives that were uniquely given to St. Peter as opposed to the rest of the apostles. And when we look at that criteria, right, that is somebody who holds the keys of the kingdom in relation to the apostles. So whereas the apostles exercise that authority of binding and loosing, that power to excommunicate, that power is dependent, right, on the one who actually holds it. So the only successor of Peter is the person who can say that, who can say, like,
Right.
hey, all you successors of the apostles, the exercise of your authority depends on me, right?
Hmm.
Because that's what Peter could say to the apostles. He could say to the apostles, like, the exercise of your authority depends on me. However you want to understand that, right? There's perhaps different ways, hypothetically, you could understand that. But there's some kind of dependence. I mean, just the idea of a key holder and a key user, one key holder, multiple key users, implies there's some kind of dependence there. So
Right.
that's why I would be hesitant to say that Antioch and Alexandria are successors of Peter in that sense, because there is no unique Petrine prerogative that was given directly by Christ to St. Peter that is uniquely held by those sees. Instead, we refer to the patriarchs of Alexandria and Antioch as successors of Peter, in perhaps the same way we would refer to the patriarch of Constantinople as like the successor of St. Andrew, right? That he is, like, as a matter of historical lineage, they trace their, like, who was the first bishop of that see, right? In Constantinople's case, traditionally it's seen as St. Andrew, right? That doesn't mean that
Right.
Constantinople inherits a unique prerogative given to Andrew. It just means that that's the historical lineage of their see. Same with, what is it, Antioch, right? Being founded by St. Peter, is that's a historical lineage, not a unique prerogative. In fact, even if Rome was not founded by St. Peter, though it was, that actually would not even stop Rome's ability to have the unique Petrine prerogatives, because it isn't so much the founding of the see as much
Right.
as it is the fact that that's where Peter dies and leaves his ministry, right? That
Hmm.
makes Rome the unique successor.
And even the people that bring this objection up, Antioch has just as much of a claim to this Petrine prerogative as Rome. They're not even treating Antioch as if that was the case. Like they would literally
No,
put Constantinople above Antioch. So they don't actually, anybody who says this doesn't give Antioch the preeminent authority that they're claiming that it can have. So it actually
right.
just falls flat and it doesn't make sense. It's funny because I just got this book here by Francis Dvornik. I don't know if you've heard of it. So it's the idea of apostolicity in
Hmm.
Byzantium and
Okay.
the legend of the Apostle Andrew. So I've been doing some research on this, and from what I've been able to find, the idea of connecting St. Andrew to Constantinople is actually a fabrication that Constantinople comes up with in order to give itself and prop itself up to be closer to Rome. So there's a lot of interesting things. What I've been discovering is that Constantinople, every accusation that Orthodox make against Rome actually applies to Constantinople. They're
Hmm.
the brother that's trying to usurp authority for himself and put himself above the other brother bishops. But in
Yeah.
looking at the ecclesiology for the Orthodox Church, was there anything that did seem compelling? Like when I hear that, okay, St. Peter, he does have all of these prerogatives as head of the apostles, but every bishop is a St. Peter. Every bishop is St. Peter of his local diocese, and it's really like this microcosm of Petrine prerogatives for each local diocese. That kind of can make sense, but really in practicality, it doesn't make any sense. And it's funny because the same people, and I think you mentioned this earlier, the same people that try to say, well, every bishop is a Saint Peter, are also the same people saying, on the other hand, well, Peter really wasn't that special. Like, don't give him too much attention. He really wasn't that special. But then they're also saying, at the same time, they're saying, well, like every bishop is a Peter. I mean, it didn't really. I see that there's tension there, but was there anything that did seem compelling for you when you looked at Orthodox ecclesiology, where you're like, I can try to make this work, or
Yeah, certainly. Like you mentioned, that idea that all the bishops are Peter. I mean, it's certainly an attractive sounding idea. I mean, especially if you're someone like me, you were very like bought into the tradition of the first millennium. You're reading these sources that are like speaking very highly of the Pope of Rome being the successor of Peter. And so if you can kind of like shoehorn, well, actually every bishop is the successor of Peter, and the Pope is just kind of like, the most Petery out of all the Peters or something like that. That kind of like softens the blow a little bit. So I'd say that was the idea I was the most attracted to. Because it was promoted by like Father Lauren Cleanwork. Ubi Petrus has like a whole florilegium on his website saying all bishops are Peter, like a list of quotes from church fathers who say things like this. And what I came to realize, I mean, there were many. This is largely through my dialogues with Eric Ibarra, which he sent me a free copy of his book on the papacy. Eventually, as I was like dialogue with him, actually, I read it at least partially when I was in Italy several years ago, and when I didn't read the whole thing when I was in Italy, but I read parts of it, specifically his section
right.
on Saint Cyprian of Carthage. And to Saint Cyprian, something he points out is that while Cyprian, and there are many fathers who speak this way, including fathers who also have a very high view of the papacy as well, speak this way about all bishops being the successors of St. Peter. And what he points out is that for Cyprian, the reason, or like where he's getting this logic from is he's talking about like the unity of a local church, right? The principle of unity for a local church has to be the episcopal monarch, right? The singular bishop, right? Just as Peter is the source of the apostolic college. A lot of the fathers are going to talk this way, that Peter is the origin of the apostolic college. And Cyprian coins this phrase where he says the unity is still preserved in the source, right? So that because Peter is the source of the apostles, because he's the first, some traditions even have Peter ordaining the other apostles. He's the one with whom the episcopacy starts. Because of that, he's going to have a unique role in preserving the unity of that episcopacy. And you can see how this logic would apply in the case of a local church, where you have the bishop is the source of all the other clerics in that particular diocese. I mean, who ordains, right? If you want to have more priests, more deacons, who's going to be the source, the origin of all the priests and deacons in your diocese? It's going to be your local bishop, right? Your local Peter that you're going to go to, right? Who's the source of all the rites of communion, right? The rites of what priests are allowed to offer communion. At this point in church history, I don't believe priests are yet absolving people of sins. That's just the bishop. So too, who do you go if you want to have your sins absolved? You go to the bishop, right? So the bishop is at the local level the source of really all the sacramental activity in your life, right? And so you can see the clear analogy there, that just as Peter, right, in relation to the apostles, is the source of the sacraments in canonical communion, right? So too, in a local context, the bishop is going to fulfill that role, right? He's the local key bearer. He's the local rock, so to speak.
Right.
So that's, in that sense, I'm fully on board with saying that we can call local bishops local Peters, in kind of this relative sense. However, what I'm not on board with is the attempt to then leave it there and say, like, that's all the Petrine imagery means. Because here's one. Right. Both Catholics and Orthodox are going to agree that the apostles were not just priests, but they were bishops, right? Which is obviously already kind of a distinction we see with the relation between, like, Peter and the apostles and a local bishop and his priests and deacons, right? There's a sacramental difference in one case, but there's not a sacramental difference in another, right? That as St. Cyprian himself will say, Peter and the apostles were completely equal in like dignity and honor and power, right, with regard to their sacramental character. They were all equally bishops, and yet there is still a distinction among them. And in fact, this distinction, so the Orthodox tell us, is supposed to be what creates the archetype for the authority that a local bishop has. And so then you just have to ask the question, well, what authority does a local bishop have? Well, luckily, the Church of Moscow answers this by saying that a local bishop has immediate, direct, and ordinary jurisdiction over his diocese. And now, but hold on a second. I thought that was modeled after St. Peter. So how is St. Peter the model of direct, immediate, and ordinary jurisdiction, right? Because who is Peter being appointed over? Literally in Matthew 16 and John 21 and these famous Petrine texts. Who is Peter's diocese? Who belongs to Peter's diocese in these contexts? It's the apostles, right? And so if Peter is going to be the model of every bishop, and every bishop exercises this very strong, almost monarchical rule over their diocese, then that implies that Peter himself exercised this very strong, almost monarchical rule over who? Over the apostles, right? And so I was starting to see logic like that and say, like, okay, the very logic that we're using to say that every bishop of Peter, in a sense, demands that the historical man Peter himself had a unique relation to the rest of the apostles, which the Orthodox themselves do not recognize today. And I was also just saying, I mean, if you just look at it, like just take a step back and you look at it, and you say, Peter was the singular head over the apostles. And many of the church fathers are going to talk about this. They're going to talk about how the reason that Christ appoints one head is so that when there's that the occasion of schism might be removed, right? So that there may be no other apostles who set up rival chairs against Peter. So there's a very strong emphasis on this being a singular and unique headship that Peter has. And Peter had, once again, he had this headship in relation to the whole college of the apostles. So if you had all the apostles together, right, Peter has this singular headship over all of them, and he's the principle of unity. Once again, whatever that means. And then Catholic and Orthodox, we're going to say that there's this body that succeeds the apostolic college called the Episcopal College, right? But now we're being told by the Orthodox that every member of the Episcopal College is Peter, which would mean that every member of the Episcopal College is the head of the Episcopal College. Which at that point, it's like, what even is what does headship even mean? Like, it's like that line from The Incredibles, right? If everyone is super, no one is. Like if everyone's the head, no one is. If everyone is Peter, nobody's Peter. And that's when you get to with all that background in mind, when you get to texts like Philip the Legate's profession of faith at the Third Ecumenical Council, when he's talking, he just calls Pope Celestine Peter. Those terms are interchangeable in the letter that's accepted by this Ecumenical Council. And he just quite frankly says that Peter is the foundation of the church, right? The one on whom the foundation of the church was laid. He's the rock, the pillar of the Catholic faith. And his successor, and he lives and reigns, and his successor is down to today, who today is Celestine. And then you just have to ask the question, like, for these early fathers, were there multiple foundations of the Catholic Church? Were there multiple rocks? Because they're talking about the universal entire Catholic Church. I mean, this is a Western bishop writing to an Eastern council, right? So this is not like a local matter that we're talking about. From their perspective, this is affecting the entire church. So this is not the time to be invoking like the local jurisdiction that I have over the Church of Rome or something like that. He's talking about the universal church, that just as Peter is the head over all the apostles, if Peter has a successor at all, he's going to be the head over all of those who claim to be the successors of the apostles. And that's just not something that you see in the Orthodox world today. And so, that's right. A lot of the conclusions that I came to about the papacy in particular that started leading me in the direction of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I see this pretty evident in the scriptures, particularly in John 21, verse 11, when it's talking about Peter hauling in the 153 fish into his net, and it says the net was not torn. And the Greek for the torn is schizo, which is related to the term schism. And we see that unity is preserved in the net of St. Peter, that the other apostles on their own, they weren't able to do this. So, and you mentioned, set the fact of one chair being set up so that no rival chairs can be set up in opposition to that one chair. I believe that comes from St. Optatus of Milevis. Some of his writings are just very explicit, and it's my go-to actually. I like going to his Against the Donatists, where he's talking about that. He says the blessed Peter both deserved to be placed over the apostles, and I like to emphasize that governmental language, and he alone received the keys of the kingdom of heaven, which he communicates to the rest. So a lot of times people think that him having the keys is in rivalry with the apostles, but no, he's communicating that he's sharing in that authority with the apostolic college. But it like you were saying, the origin of it starts with Peter. When we look at texts like this, what can we find about in today's um, ecclesiology? So if Peter has the keys, he was given the keys alone, and the apostles share in that authority, but not apart from Peter. Are we saying that today the Orthodox don't have the keys because they have, split from the Church of Rome, which is the unique successor of St. Peter?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So obviously there's different. So when we talk about the keys, this actually I wrote an article about this a while ago called "The Sword and the Keys." The keys are kind of this image of the fullness of ecclesiastical power, just as you have the sword as being the image of the fullness of civil power, right? And so it's not going to be an accident that the sword and the keys imagery is going to be respectively associated with the apostles Peter and Paul, especially in the Roman Church. So you think about the sword, right? If you have a civil magistrate, they have the sword. What does that mean? It means that they have the full range of civil power, right? Because the sword emphasizes what? The death penalty and the
Mm.
ability to wage war, right? If you can wage war and, execute criminals, surely you can tax a citizen and you can imprison a thief, right? If you have the maximum power, you have all these lesser powers as well. And excommunication, the power of the keys, is kind of like the maximum of ecclesiastical power. I mean, literally, St. Paul describes it handing someone over to Satan. I mean, that's one of the most
Mm.
drastic things an individual could do. And it's no surprise that in 1 Corinthians 5, when St. Paul is talking about excommunication, he's going to invoke imagery about the death penalty. He's going to quote that ominous phrase from Deuteronomy, you shall purge the evil from your midst. And he's talking about, he uses that with reference to excommunication, which we know from Matthew 18 is what the power of the keys signifies. The keys is primarily about including or excluding people from the community. And obviously, what we derive from that is that if you have a maximal power like excommunication, then you have subsequent, lesser powers that follow from this. Because obviously, excommunication is a binding penalty, but the keys also have loosing abilities. So this is going to be interpreted as the ability to loose sins, right? The forgiveness of sins in things like baptism and the sacrament of confession, right? All of this is going to kind of be encompassed under the power of the keys in both its positive and negative aspects. So that's why I say all that to show how this is kind of a involved question, right, about the power of the keys. So in terms of like ecclesiastical power, like could the Orthodox declare someone excommunicate from the body of Christ? We would say no. St. Thomas Aquinas is pretty clear about
Mm.
this in the Summa Theologiae, that those who are schismatics, so that is those who separate, as the Code of Canon Law even today says, right? A schismatic is somebody who refuses submission to the Roman Pontiff or those in communion with him, which certainly does describe the Eastern Orthodox who do not recognize the authority of the Roman Pontiff, right? If the Pope were to tell them to do something, they would not listen to it.
Right.
Historically, they have done that, and they have confirmed the decisions of their predecessors to rebel against the authority of Rome and all these kinds of things. So they do not lawfully exercise the keys. They do not lawfully excommunicate. There's then recently been some discussion about whether or not they have the ability to hear confessions, like forgive sins
Mm.
in confession, as well as perform like marriages, things that typically fall under like what we call ecclesiastical jurisdiction. It's not an issue that I've studied extensively. From my understanding, the Holy See actually does like explicitly grant certain powers to the Orthodox and
Mm.
actually allows their sacraments of confession and marriage to be valid. At least, certainly in the case if a Catholic were to seek that out in some kind of emergency situation, the Church would grant faculties to hear that. Even that idea even goes back to Saint Augustine, who said that you could go to a Donatist bishop if you had no Catholic bishop around, in order to receive the sacraments in an emergency case like that. But strictly speaking, no. I mean, as we've talked about, Peter is the key bearer. And if you want to exercise the keys, you can only do so in consort with the key bearer. So perhaps the
Mm.
key bearer gives you special permissions, right? As we saw with what Pope Francis did for the SSPX, who were also a schismatic group, right? He gave special permissions for them to hear confessions and to perform marriages. But he could also take that away, right? And so that I think that kind of hopefully answers your question there.
Yeah, and you actually answered another question that I had because the SSPX, prior to their excommunication, they were deprived of their faculties to um, absolve sins, if I'm not mistaken. So that
Yes.
that that made me curious. I'm like, well, the Orthodox, they're technically in schism as well, and the SSPX at the time weren't in formal schism, but yet the Orthodox, their sacrament of reconciliation was seen as valid, or at least illicit but valid. But the SSPX, if I'm not mistaken, they didn't. You couldn't get your sins absolved from an SSPX priest. So is it because the Roman pontiff has because he's a unique successor of Peter, he has the keys. He therefore has the authority to make that judgment call.
Yeah, I mean, and people. I do think like where you see an affirmation of like sacramental validity. I think that's in Vatican II. I think is where you see a recognition, like a mutual recognition of each other's sacraments as valid. And there's different theories that some people propose. Like some people make a big deal about the Orthodox. Unlike the SSPX, the Orthodox actually had historic like sees and bishops that historically had jurisdiction, and the Pope
Right.
technically never specifically took that away. Because I mean, the Pope, I mean, as
Mm,
the key bearer, I mean, like using the example of like the civil magistrate, right? If you have the power of the sword, right, you have the power of like delegation, right? That's one of the things it means to be the ruler, the governor, is that you govern these things. And so taking away someone's exercise of the power of the keys is a particular judgment, right? That usually comes from something like an excommunication, a formal anathema against a particular group, or like it usually has to be made explicit. And so some people would say that the Orthodox technically they were never like formally excommunicated in that particular way. Like the excommunication against Constantinople in 1054 was really just against Constantinople,
mm,
and really the Orthodox only start being regarded as like formal schismatics after their rejection of the Council of Lyon and the Council of Florence. Though even there, I'm not aware of any like specific excommunication where they like all of a sudden declare that they're no longer have certain faculties. Perhaps it was implicit in because like even like Florence and Lyon too, they don't actually, as far as I'm aware, like issue specific anathemas. Rather, it was like you have to sign on to this bull of union, and it was kind of just understood that if you didn't, that you were outside of the church, but it was never like a formally pronounced sentence. That was the case. So different people debate it, but it ultimately comes down to, if the Catholic view is correct, the Pope is the supreme uh, head over the church, that he is the one who has the keys. He could delegate that power, he could take it away as he saw fit, and that's what happened in the case of the SSPX, where the Pope explicitly, gave them certain faculties, like to hear confessions, like you could validly and licitly receive confession and a marriage from an SSPX priest, but he did not give them that permission to offer the Eucharist, for example. So you would
mm.
not, that their masses were not seen as being licit, at least as far as I'm aware. Which isn't to say that like if you went to one of their masses, it would be invalid. Like no, it would be valid. But they didn't they only regularized like particular ones, which I know like to an Eastern Orthodox hearing that can kind of sound like legalistic. Like we're talking kind of like within the Catholic frame of reference here, but you're certainly correct
Right.
that it all does kind of flow out of this imagery, out of this notion that Peter is the key bearer and the apostles, the successors of the apostles, are the key users. And yeah, St. Francis de Sales pointed this out in the Catholic controversy. It's like, yeah, how can you have the exercise of the keys without the one who actually possesses them? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense.
Right. I want to get back to your story a little bit.
Sure.
How was the reaction like when you decided to come back to the Catholic Church and, leave Orthodoxy?
Yeah, which well, I'll first say I technically wasn't coming back to the Catholic Church because
Right,
I
right,
never actually formally joined.
right.
I was like on that trajectory, but I never formally joined.
Mm,
But the reaction was generally not great. I think I definitely could have handled the transition better. I had like a couple conversations with my priest. I told him that I was like, this is the direction I was leading. And my priest, great guy. I think he was probably not the best pastoral fit for me. He was kind of an older gentleman. Didn't really understand certain things, about like the youth. And so just kind of had a hard time like relating to him personally. And yeah, so he definitely didn't take it well. I didn't want to have like an individual conversation with every single person at my parish, so I ended up just kind of like sending out a bunch of like an email. I sent out like a general email to like select individuals who I was like particularly close with, explaining that I was, becoming Catholic. And then I gave them the offer. I'm like, I have another thing written out that kind of goes into more detail about my reasons. And if you would like me to send that to you, I can. If not, I don't have to. And some people said they wanted to hear it. Other people said they didn't want to hear it. So I kind of gave them that choice if they wanted to hear that. And so I don't really talk to anyone from my parish regularly anymore. I did meet with my parish, old parish quickly got a new priest shortly after I left, and so I've since met with and I knew him. He was like a member of the congregation before. I've since met with him, and of course he kind of like extended the olive branch of like, if you ever want to come back, you can join the Orthodox Church. And I was like, thank you. I didn't leave for any personal reasons. Like I had no personal animosities against anyone. If anything, the community was what was keeping me there for as long as it did. And so it was probably one of the most difficult things I've ever done in my life, to be honest. Like it was very, like losing that community was very hard, and I was very upset about it for a long time. Which I mean, it still grieves my heart, to a certain extent today. I feel like I'm much more at peace with it. But yeah, the reactions were overall pretty negative from the Orthodox side. And of course, I was going into the Catholic Church. I like didn't really know anyone, because the way I described it, it's almost like transferring from like a small town college to like a big like university. Like it was just like huge compared to the Orthodox world.
Right.
And I just kind of felt like a fish out of water. Like I would go to like young adults groups and stuff, and I just like I don't know even how to explain why I'm here. Like most people don't know about Eastern Orthodoxy, and I kind of felt like a fish out of water for a while. But I eventually found really good, really strong Catholic community and Catholic friends that has, I'd say, yeah, definitely like come on par, if not outmatching what I had in Eastern Orthodoxy. So.
Right. What would you say to somebody that is wrestling with that right now? They they're thinking that the Catholic Church is true and they want to make that transition. I've been speaking to a few people. I'm kind of in an awkward place because historically, the past 3 years I helped uplift and promote the Orthodox Church and really build it here in the United States. And I always saw it as a good thing. I was like, the majority of people that became Orthodox through the content were former Protestants,
Mhm.
or atheists. Sometimes even Muslims would reach out to me. A few Catholics, Catholics would be sprinkled in there. So it kind of puts me in an awkward place now that I'm being more dogmatic in my Catholic faith now, because I just recently concluded that I'm going to stick to my Catholic faith, and that's exactly what I'm going to promote from here on out. And I stopped since then running my Roots of Orthodoxy page. So it kind of puts me in an awkward place. But people still reach out to me and they're like, hey, I'm starting to see the Catholic Church make sense. This ecclesiology from the Orthodox Church, it doesn't make sense. There's so many things that I'm wrestling with theologically that I'm just hitting a wall with. And I'm helping them because they're asking me. But I always feel awkward. I always feel awkward to kind of do that. But one of the things before I ask you the question, one of the things I do want to bring up is I'm kind of changing my tune just a little bit about it. Before I used to be like, praise God, you embraced an apostolic faith, you embraced a faith that you can deepen your relationship with Christ, and you now have this beautiful, rich patrimony and tradition. I'm changing my tune just a little bit because what I ended up seeing is that yes, there are people that join Orthodoxy for the right reasons. They want to grow deeper in their relationship with Christ. But what I'm seeing, and even just personally, even some of my friends that ended up embracing Orthodoxy, is that they're going over to these churches and then they're becoming radicalized. They're becoming radicalized by ideology, by falsehood, by propaganda, by talking points. They're being told, oh, those Latins that you used to be a part of, those guys are evil and they did all this bad stuff to us throughout history. They really don't have grace. Those guys are bad people. Like, good thing you joined us. And then I'm starting to interact with them again, be like, hey, how's it going? Now they hate me. Now they hate, the Catholic Church. And I'm like, what happened? Like, we were, I was even encouraging you to go and check out the Divine Liturgy. And now everything turned around and now you hate us. And now you say our priests don't have grace and all this nonsensical stuff. So I'm kind of changing my tune a little bit. But anyway, I forgot where I was going with that. But the question is, what would you say to somebody who is wrestling with the idea of, transitioning to the Catholic Church, but they're just so rooted in their community at the Orthodox Church?
Yeah, I mean, I will note that I found it interesting with the recent excommunications of the SSPX. Like every accusation that is thrown against those who join the SSPX could equally be thrown against Catholics who leave the Catholic Church to become Eastern Orthodox. I'm not saying every single case, but I've seen a lot of cases where the same mindset that drives some people to the SSPX is the same mindset that drives a lot of people to Eastern Orthodoxy, which is evident
Right.
from the fact that there are a lot of people who are in the SSPX who end up becoming Eastern Orthodox as well. And so I just find it kind of interesting that perhaps something for, Vatican officials, hopefully, I mean, I'm sure they probably won't do this because of ecumenical reasons, but like, if you're going to be like denouncing the SSPX for causing people to like insult the new mass and insult the Catholic Church and be disobedient to the Roman authorities and all this stuff, it's like you got to address the elephant in the room and realize that the Orthodox is just another avenue that these same people are going down. And so if you're going to address one in these like very harsh terms, like correctly, I would say like, the SSPX, like they did need a good butt kick, and like maybe we need to consider doing that on the other side as well. So I just want to make that note. But to directly answer your question, to somebody in that situation, I mean, it's highly dependent on the individual, which I've actually personally been in dialogue with several people who fit the description that you gave, where they're very firmly rooted in their Orthodox community and their Orthodox, upbringing, whether, actual upbringing or like theological, spiritual upbringing. But now they're starting to see, a lot of the goodness in Catholicism, a lot of the truth in Catholicism. They're starting to see perhaps a lot of like the toxic behavior that you're describing. And they're like, hold on a second, that's not what I signed up for when I
Right.
joined the Orthodox Church, right? And so it's getting them to question, like, maybe this actually isn't where I'm supposed to be. The first thing I usually say to people I encounter in this situation, once again, it kind of depends on the individual, but usually this kind of individual, they've been like going through a lot of like transitions. Like maybe they were an atheist, then they became like a Protestant, now they became Orthodox, and now they're like, oh, now I think I should become Catholic. Like in a case like that, I would say, okay, hold on, let's pause.
Right.
Like I don't want people to be making like rash decisions, because just as easily as you flip the switch and say like, oh, the second I have like a problem with Orthodoxy, now I'm going to become Catholic. Like I want to make sure that's not the case, because like you're going to have problems as a Catholic. I think Catholicism is kind of benefited in that like our problems are kind of like out in the open for everyone to see all the time.
Right.
Whereas, and so people who become Catholic oftentimes do so already being aware of a lot of the problems with the Catholic Church. Whereas in the Orthodox Church, that's not really the case. That you're kind of sold this almost problem-free church. Maybe you'll get like oh, hey, no, of course we have problems, guys. But then they'll just kind of like leave it at that. You don't exactly get like hour-long live streams of people going through every scandalous thing every Orthodox parish is
Right.
doing, as you do in the Catholic Church. And so I think that's where a lot of people get disillusioned with Orthodoxy, is they're kind of sold this like picture of this perfect problem-free church. Come here, all your problems will be gone, and they realize that that's not the case. So usually, if they're then looking towards Catholicism, they're probably already aware of the problems in the Catholic Church. But I would first say, like, don't make any rash decisions. Like, talk to your own pastor about it. Like, I think that's important. Like, don't just spring like out of nowhere say, hey guys, I'm leaving. Like, do it in dialogue. As well as don't make any, this is from St. Ignatius of Loyola. He says, don't make any decisions when you're in a state of desolation as well. Which for, Orthodox maybe aren't familiar with that terminology. And I know there's a lot of skepticism of like Ignatian spirituality and stuff in the Orthodox circles. But just take it out of that context for a second. What he's essentially saying is like, when you are like interiorly perceiving that you are like far from God, or like, not even that you're like in sin or whatever, but just like God is not present to you, like for whatever reason he is not like speaking to you, like he's not leading you, you have like no sense of direction from God, from the Holy Spirit, that is not the time to be making life altering decisions,
Mhm.
when you don't have that sense of God's presence. And so if you don't have that sense of God's presence, take intentional time in prayer to foster that and ask God for a sense of his presence and his direction. Obviously, if you're committing sins, stop doing that. And repent of your sins. Be in a state of grace insofar as it's possible for you to do that in your own conscious experience, and then make a decision from a spiritually healthy place. And that's why it's
Mhm.
also important to not just be interested in the Catholic intellectual tradition, but also get familiar with the Catholic spiritual tradition. I always recommend Saint Therese of Lisieux because she played such an important role in my own conversion. Actually, I when I was Orthodox, I dated a Catholic girl, and she's the one who introduced me to Saint Therese and her spirituality. And I think that
Mhm.
actually probably did more to soften my heart to Catholicism than like the endless YouTube videos and blog articles that I read. Was
Right.
like seeing Saint Teresa's spirituality lived out in this woman, and then she gave me a book by Father Jacques Philippe called the Way of Trust and Love, and So I read through that, and so like getting to like see it lived out, and then also like reading about it, had a very profound impact on me. And so I chose actually to formally enter the Catholic Church, or at least receive my first communion in the Catholic Church on Saint Teresa's feast day, October
Mm.
1st. And I this my ex girlfriend told me that that previous year she had prayed a prayer of consecration of me to Saint Therese that I would become Catholic.
Wow.
Um, and I later found out that Saint Therese has another feast day in the Byzantine churches where she's celebrated, and that's May 17th, the anniversary of her canonization, which is also my
Mm.
birthday.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, and then also specifically, she was canonized May 17th, 1925, and my 24th birthday was last year, May 17th, 2024. Sorry, 2025, and that was the 100th anniversary of her canonization, and I turned 24, which is how old she was when she died. And so I found those connections like very. So for me personally, Saint Therese played a very big role. So of course I'm
She
going to
was
advocate. She's
interceding for
also
you.
exactly. She's the patron of missions. So I would, yeah, recommend developing a devotion to Saint Therese, as well as like the Blessed Virgin Mary. I think that's very important. Especially like a lot of Orthodox are skeptical of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. I actually just recently wrote an article on my Substack, explaining why I think Eastern Orthodox, even without becoming Catholic, can affirm the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. And so I would encourage Orthodox, like especially if you're like Catholic friendly, thinking about becoming Catholic, like start praying to Our Lady under the title of the Immaculate Conception, and just like ask her to be leading you in, wherever it is that she wants you to go. So I think like having that spiritual foundation is like the most important thing, because something that I've definitely learned after having done this for like 8 years is like it's not just an intellectual game, which is
Hmm.
very cliche to say, but I've only like truly experienced that over the past few years. That it has to be spiritual, and then yeah, just like be open about it. Don't keep this secret. Don't keep this like your own like little thing. Like bring it to God, bring it to your pastors, bring it to your friends. Just be open about it, be honest about it, be honest with yourself about where you're at. And if you ultimately come to the conviction that the Catholic faith is the true faith, just know that it is never wrong to follow Christ. That no matter what
Hmm.
suffering that you may endure because of your decision to become Catholic, which I mean, people have endured much more suffering than I have, for choosing to become Catholic. But I have certainly endured my fair share of, at least first or 21st century, first world suffering that you can experience, for being Catholic. And it's worth it because that is part of our redemption. Because Christ was the first one to be rejected by his own. He was the first one, to experience that loss of community, that loss of support, and yet he remained joyful because his will was perfectly aligned with God. And so just praying for that alignment with the divine will, is very important. So those are a lot. I mean, it's yeah, not very like academic-y, but I think that's like genuinely the advice that I've given to people who have pursued Catholicism from Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, sacrifice it's just part of it. What would you say to somebody who I did a video called "Give Me 15 Minutes and I Will Prove the Papacy," and I just used the scriptures alone to build a biblical case as to why the papacy is apostolic. It's scriptural. You can find it in the Bible. And there was an Orthodox gentleman who commented, and he's like, he sounded pretty convinced, like, "Yo, this makes a lot of sense." And then and then I was talking to him, and then he's like, well, I'm already Orthodox. He's on your church says it's okay. So, so like he kind of had like an indifferent attitude about like that urgency to be joined to the visible bounds of the Catholic Church because our church already has a concession that they have a valid Eucharist, a valid sacramentality, valid priesthood, that they are a valid church. They're just in imperfect communion with ours. So what would you say to somebody who's kind of like in that complacent phase that they don't really feel an urgency or a need to go to the Catholic Church because they feel like they're already good? And if I can phrase it like this, I've seen like this meme video where there's an Orthodox gentleman. He kind of posits this idea. He calls it the Roman Catholic dilemma. He's saying if the Catholic Church says that the Orthodox Church has valid sacraments and we have a true Eucharist, meaning that we have Christ and Christ is everything, then why do I need to become Catholic? Like, what? Why would that even make sense?
Yeah, I've always been puzzled by people just pointing to the fact that the Catholic Church says Orthodoxy has valid sacraments and then kind of leaving or like making a huge deal out of that and then just like having everything else be kind of like a footnote to that. Like the Catholic Church has always affirmed that Orthodox have had valid sacraments since the time of the schism. Like as
Yeah.
far as I'm aware, there is never a time like the declaring that the Orthodox have valid sacraments in terms of like priesthood and Eucharist. That was not a Vatican II thing. Like
Right.
the Roman Church. I mean, obviously, like there were disputes about sacramental validity among schismatics going back to like I mean, it goes back way to like third century dispute between Cyprian and Stephen. But even after the third century, you still have people talking about this, especially with respect to holy orders. The question of whether or not, because it's generally agreed that baptisms are valid, but the question of whether or not there are holy orders that are valid, we kind of took a little bit longer to hammer out. That gets hammered out around like sixth, seventh, eighth centuries. You kind of see stuff like this. But I mean, even into the like modern era, you have popes calling schismatic bishops fake bishops, even though like like you have Pius IX calling the old Catholics fake bishops, even though like he wasn't disbelieving that they have valid orders or anything like that. But anyways, so yeah, this idea that Orthodox have valid sacraments is actually not like a big deal theologically. All it means is that when you're baptized, you truly incorporated into Christ. However, an atheist could get baptized validly, right? And if an atheist could partake of a valid Eucharist, right? And yet, what does that do for the atheist? It actually just makes things worse for them, right? Because they're committing an act of sacrilege, right? That when you have an actually holy thing like a sacrament, right? And then you use it in an illicit way, that is actually, in some ways, a worse crime than if you just didn't have the sacrament to begin with. So, I mean, you see many examples of this in the Old Testament. Think about like Nadab and Abihu in the book of Leviticus, who use illicit fire. Like they're in the sanctuary, they're in the altar, area that was built by Moses and the Israelites, but they use it improperly. I think about throughout the Old Testament when you have the kings worshiping in the high places, right? It's not like they're worshiping some other god, right? As if they're committing idolatry. Well, I mean, it's a species of idolatry, but they're worshiping God improperly in a way that he didn't command. Or think about the Samaritans, right? Christ explicitly tells the Samaritan woman that salvation is of the Jews, subtext, not the Samaritans, that the Samaritans are wrong in that they don't worship at the correct temple. Now, is Christ in that dialogue, is he commenting on what the eternal fate of all the Samaritans were prior to after their split from mainstream Israel? No, he doesn't seem to be commenting on that. Obviously, the Samaritan woman herself, the fact that she receives Christ and that the Israelites, the true church of the Old Testament, largely rejects Christ, that's quite telling. But Christ himself clearly has a conception that there are licit and illicit ways to worship. Even if you are in fact performing an act of worship, you have to not only perform the act of worship to the true God, you have to do it in the right way. And so when we say that that Eastern Orthodox sacraments are valid but illicit, that's not just like a footnote, right? That's like actually a very serious accusation that we're making. We're saying that you are worshiping God improperly in a way that he has not commanded. This is in fact what the second commandment is all about. Because you think about the first commandment is you shall worship the Lord your God, right? The second commandment, you shall not make unto yourself a graven image, right? The reason that Israel wasn't supposed to make images in the Old Covenant is because God hadn't revealed his form, right? They had not seen God, right? So to make an image would be to worship God in a way that he didn't command you to be worshipped, right? So that's why it's also a species of idolatry to worship God in an illicit way. And so when we make the accusation of schism, we're saying that you are actively offending God by worshiping him in an illicit way. Now, similarly, just as, like I said, Christ, when he said that the Samaritans were illicitly worshiping God, I don't read into that a therefore ipso facto condemnation of every single Samaritan who ever lived, right? So too, when I say this about the Eastern Orthodox, we're not necessarily making an ipso facto condemnation of every Eastern Orthodox Christian who has ever lived or will ever live, right? We're simply stating the facts as the Catholic Church teaches, including at Vatican II, because everyone likes to read that, the nice things in Vatican and Lumen Gentium about how, all these different groups, which is not just the Eastern Orthodox, by the way, right? We also talk about how like different religions have a share, right, in the truth of God, and that these are all things that are leading towards the fullness of faith in the Catholic Church. So it's not as if the Eastern Orthodox are unique. Oh, well, sorry, let me correct myself. They are unique in that they have perhaps the most similarity out of any non-Catholic group, but they're not unique in that they're like the only ones who have these sanctifying elements. Like we say that of Protestants, we say this of other religious groups to lesser degrees, obviously, but that's still real. And yet, Vatican II still says that because this is in Lumen Gentium, it says that because the devil is the deceiver of men, who leads people, right, essentially to eternal destruction, right, through deceit, through error, right, through things like heresy and schism. This is why the church promotes evangelistic mission, right? Vatican II also says that if you come to the conviction that the Catholic Church is the true church, which it also says you have a moral obligation to come to that conviction as well. So it's not as if you can just not investigate this. But once you come to that conviction, if you then choose to remain outside of the Catholic Church, you will not be saved. That is explicitly taught in Vatican II. So if you're somebody who has interiorly been convicted of the truth of the Catholic faith, and your attitude is simply like, well, they say I'm fine anyway, so I'm just going to stay where I'm at because I want my community. Actually, no, you're the exact person that Vatican II is addressing when saying that if you know that the Catholic Church is the true faith instituted by Christ, and you choose to remain outside, that is actually damnable. And obviously, like being in a schismatic group itself just has intrinsic dangerous qualities to it, of being led into error, being led into false doctrine, and ultimately being led into, just further and further away from Christ. So while the Eucharist and baptism being present among the Orthodox can be an incentive towards unity, and God willing it is, it can also be not good for those who partake of it, because as Paul says, right, if you drink the blood of Christ, you eat the body of Christ without discerning, you become guilty concerning the body and blood of Christ, right? And so if you are partaking at a schismatic altar in a way that God hasn't set up, that's not a good thing to be doing.
Yeah, I would also add to the question, what am I lacking? I would ask these people, I would ask them, what does it mean to love God? What does it mean to follow God? It means to obey him. So if it is true that the papacy is something that he divinely established, that he instituted as part of the essential constitution of the church, then we have a moral imperative to be united to the church that has this papacy, that has this office that he himself established, if it is indeed true that this is something that he did institute. So when they ask, what am I lacking? I mean, you're lacking so much. Yes, you have the Eucharist. Yes, we've recognized sainthood in your church, but you're missing the being united fully to the mystical body of Christ in this present life, being a visible member of a church that has a living voice because Christ is living through his church, a church that has a living magisterium. I mean, just look at the track record. Our church has 21 ecumenical councils, and it continues to talk about faith and morals as it relates to today's time. Faith and morals, the doctrines don't change, but they become more explicit over time, with this idea of elaborating on doctrines, doctrinal maturity. We have this. Your church, unfortunately, because it has severed itself from the head, it no longer has this function. It no longer has a means and a mechanism for binding the church universal. It no longer has a voice. It no longer has an authority. Every bishop is for himself. Every patriarch is for himself. You can find a few bishops and patriarchs that agree with each other, but there is no means or mechanism to bind the church universal. And so you are missing a lot. I know other Catholics, they won't say this. They want to be pretty diplomatic, and I still think we can be respectful in saying this. But no, you are missing something. You're outside of the visible bounds of communion with the mystical body of Christ, and so you're lacking in the instruction. Christ gave authority to his church to lead his church into all truth. It's not so that he established his church and then he goes away and then you guys take care of it. No, he's with his church all the time, and he's guiding the church. He's teaching the church. He's making sure that the sheep of the flock of Christ are not being bound to error. And we're the only church that can claim this. That was one of the things that was very attractive to me, is that the Catholic Church has the highest truth claim. The highest truth claim being that the faithful can never be bound to an erroneous teaching. The Orthodox cannot claim that because they have a diversity of beliefs. So, unfortunately, they have been bound to false teachings. So I know they'll contest that, but not to make this polemical, but that's what I would say. Yes, you are missing something, and we love you where you are, but we also love you enough to call you out and say, hey, you need to be fully united and become a visible member of the Catholic Church if you do see that this is the true faith. And you can't be complacent and say, well, I'm good because your church says I'm good. That's not the case, and that's not what's happening here. Um, what would you say to somebody who, I forgot what the question was, but basically the line of thinking is that people, they want to leave the church over things that have nothing to do with faith or morals, doctrinal issues. I mean, people have left the church on the basis of the liturgy alone. And I actually do sympathize with that premise. The Novus Ordo, it's so scandalous. Like, how can this be the one true church if, there's all these abuses that are taking place, and not even abuses, like some of this stuff is just straight up normalized. What would you say to somebody who leaves the Catholic Church, but not on the basis of doctrine or faith and morals, but on the basis of like practical, the church says that Catholics and Muslims worship the same God, or the church says that, well, I guess that would be somewhat, downstream from the doctrinal side, but a lot of the times people are like, oh, you have extraordinary lay ministers at your church. That can't be the true church. What would you say to somebody who's leaving the church on that basis? Because we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing this, the scandal, or the Pope said something, so I'm very disillusioned. I want to leave the church now.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. If I could just like briefly touch on like somewhat doctrinal stuff, as you mentioned, like the whole like kind of like vague, like Pope said this, Muslims and Christians worship the same God, because that is like kind of like typical thing. Like it's not like super in depth, but it's just kind of like something like this. The first thing I would say is, if you just like hear some teaching from the Catholic faith and you're like, this doesn't sound quite right. The odds are like there are a significant number of people in the Eastern Orthodox Church who hold that exact view and teach it
Right.
from the pulpit. And
Right.
so it's like, like Eric Ibarra brings up the example of like the death penalty. It's like, Pope Francis, I mean, which I respectfully disagree with Pope Francis's teaching on the death penalty if it's understood to be contradictory to prior teaching. I know there's people who try to reconcile it. I won't throw my hat in on that project of reconciliation. Maybe it can, maybe it can't. But insofar as it seems to be read not in harmony, I think that's not great. But if you go over to the OCA website teaching about the death penalty, what does it say? No death penalty, guys. Like no death penalty, violation of human dignity. Like you'll see this professed by all these different Orthodox synods, Orthodox bishops, which, the Orthodox would come back and say like, well, it's not infallible. We don't believe that everything a patriarch or bishop says is infallible, but it's like, well, hold on a second. The reason you left Catholicism is because, like historically you're saying that like we're teaching error, we're teaching heresy, and that justifies leaving. So how come your bishop teaching heresy, teaching error doesn't justify leaving? I'm not saying there's no answer to that question, but odds are the person who's thinking along those lines hasn't thought through that. And that was actually a large part of my own conversion, was realizing like if I'm going to have a consistent criteria of deciding when I am going to like suspend obedience to a hierarch versus not, I can't do that without something like the papacy and the Petrine institution. Like otherwise, it's always going to be completely arbitrary in my own choice if there's not an a priori principle of canonical communion, right? Otherwise, like the second a bishop starts professing heresy, right? I mean, I could just say like, look, being a successor of the apostles means teaching the true faith. That guy's not teaching the true faith. He's not a successor of the apostles. I'm going to go to my true Orthodox church over here, right? So that's a point in the whole true Orthodox, genuine Orthodox thing. I think that if somebody is really considering leaving Catholicism for Orthodoxy, you really need to look into the true Orthodox, genuine Orthodox, and see the things that they're claiming about the World Orthodox Church that you're going to
Right.
be joining. I think you'll see a lot of those problems, like with ecumenism, yeah, especially with like ecumenism and even like certain things related to sexual ethics. All those, a lot of those accusations that you see being made against Catholic authorities, those can also be made against Orthodox authorities, and the genuine and true Orthodox groups are very good at gathering all the evidence to demonstrate that to you. So give those guys a true hearing before you become Eastern Orthodox. But more directly to your question about like the practical stuff, like what about extraordinary ministers or female altar boys and all this stuff, what I would say is I agree that those things are important. Like liturgy is very important. I myself, I go to a very reverent Novus Ordo parish on Sundays, and I've recently started attending the Tridentine Mass as well. I've developed a deeper appreciation for traditional Latin liturgics, and so I've been able to like empathize a lot more with like a lot of the trads who like really have a big
Right.
issue with liturgical changes. Like I'm starting to see more of what their critiques are, and I'm like, yeah. But something that's important to keep in mind is like the church has the ability to make changes to her discipline and her worship life, as long as it does not affect something that was immutably divinely set by God, right? Aside from that, which is not a ton of stuff in the life of the church, I mean, things like the male only priesthood, right? The matter and form of like the sacraments, like the use of bread in the liturgy. Though actually that's an interesting issue worth bringing up, the whole bread issue, because obviously one of the main reasons that the Orthodox broke off from the Catholics back in 1054 was over the Latin use of azymes, or unleavened bread. So I think that's actually a perfect example of like this minor liturgical issue causing this great split in the church. I'm not saying that was like the only political theological reason going on, but that was the main like driving. If the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is kind of what like drove the First World War, the use of unleavened bread is kind of what drove the schism to begin with. And so like all the Orthodox, I mean, this is a consistent criticism. The Orthodox from the 11th century all the way until the 19th century were saying that this is one of the chief heresies and problems with the Latins, is that they use unleavened bread in the Eucharist. And yet, if you read the sources, you can see quite clearly that Christ and the apostles originally used unleavened bread in the Eucharist. And it was the church herself who changed this discipline from using unleavened bread to using leavened bread, right? So the Orthodox themselves believe, and obviously we're not going to say, and we've never said, that leavened bread is invalid or illicit or anything like that. And yet it was a genuine liturgical change that was made over time, right? The Byzantine liturgy itself, even like things like the development of icon veneration, these extravagant liturgical things, the creation of all these like minor orders like subdeacon, exorcist, acolyte. As fun as it is to like joke about, the apostles totally created all these things. They obviously didn't. Like the church clearly has the ability to create different ministries. And in the ministries that she creates, things like subdeacon, acolytes, lector, exorcist, she absolutely has the authority to govern how those ministries work, what they're permitted to do, what they're not permitted to do. Maybe you don't like how the church governs that. For me, like when I look at how the sacrament of confession was governed in the early days, the fact that it was restricted to a bishop, that you would perform penance before receiving absolution, I personally think that was not the wisest pastoral choice in the world, right? I think that was a poor pastoral choice, and I quite like the fact that we don't do it that way anymore. I like the fact that priests can hear confessions and we get penances assigned after the fact and we get absolution immediately. I think that's actually a very good change. And it's a change that happened not only in the Catholic West, but also in the Orthodox East, right? And I think many Orthodox would probably also agree that that was a positive change. But the point that I'm making is that we all agree that when it comes to these post-apostolic things that we've created, or even if it goes back to the apostles, like unleavened bread does, the church was given all authority over her sacraments, right? Christ says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore, right? And make disciples of all nations, baptizing them, right? So the apostles are given that full sacramental ecclesiastical power over the church's worship life. And sometimes that authority is used well. Sometimes it's used poorly. Like I talked about with the authority of the keys, right? Excommunication kind of represents the fullness of that power. That means she also has lesser powers, right? If you can cast someone out of the church, if you can cast someone out of the church, you can create a role called subdeacon, or you can create a role called acolyte, and you could allow women into these created roles if you wanted to, even if, maybe we shouldn't do that. It's because it doesn't really look that great. But we can, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And obviously I'm not going to defend every prudential choice the church has ever made, nor would the Orthodox defend every prudential choice their church has ever made. I mean, look at Orthodox canons regarding new mothers, that they can't receive the Eucharist for 40 days after giving birth to a child. This is commented on by Orthodox saints like Nicodemus the Hagiorite in his canonical commentary called The Rudder. He explicitly affirms it. Same with women during their menstrual cycles, that they have to abstain from the Eucharist. There are a lot of Orthodox who don't like that rule, right? And who certainly do not follow it. And yet, are we going to say that by saying that that was probably not the best decision, that somehow falsifies the Orthodox Church? I wouldn't make that argument personally. And so too, I would ask the same charity from the Orthodox who look at certain Catholic disciplines, that these post-apostolic disciplines, things that fall under the legitimate authority of the church, even if exercised incorrectly, that's not enough to get you around the truly dogmatic theological issues that separate the East and the West. That's why I think those are more important to figure out, and then, care about the secondary things secondarily.
Yeah, I would encourage people to keep their eye on the ball. I feel like a lot of times we keep our eye off the ball when we're examining which church is the one true church. The Catholic Church is the only church that has preserved the fullness of the apostolic deposit of faith. And
Hmm.
if you see some minor liturgical change or whatever the case may be, I mean, that's not sufficient enough to break away from the church. I mean, there's just so much there. I want to ask you about some of the talking points that I'm sure you encountered when you went to the Orthodox Church. Whenever anybody goes to the Orthodox Church, one of the big talking points you're going to hear is that Orthodoxy is the unchanging church. We're the only church that hasn't changed. It begs the question, like, what are you talking about? Like, when you mean you haven't changed, like, what are you referring to? And oftentimes they're actually not referring to doctrine. They're referring to disciplines and administrative practices. But even those things have changed tremendously, profoundly in the Orthodox Church. So I'm always confused when they say we are the unchanging church of the first millennium and we've kept everything the same as it was back then, today. I'm like, that doesn't make sense. The liturgy has changed profoundly. The way that you administer sacraments has changed profoundly. The way that, icons have developed over time, the way that the hymnography has developed over time, including things from St. John of Damascus, and, the way that even fasting has changed over time. So I'm like, what are you referring to when you're saying you're the unchanging church? Certainly it can't be doctrine, because I can point some things out that are doctrinal innovations in your church. How did you perceive this talking point when you walked into the Orthodox Church? Was it something that you heard, and was it something that you took for granted, or was it something that you challenged in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think, whether that talking point is coming from Catholics or Orthodox, I think it's rhetorically not very wise, certainly in an age when there's like mass information access and people can
Right.
easily figure out that it's like, obviously, yeah, it also comes down to the question, like, what does that mean? Because I think what some people that I encountered legitimately meant when they would say the Orthodox Church is unchanging, like they pretty much just thought that like the way that they were doing liturgy in the year 2018, 2019, whatever it was, that is how the apostles in their, like they're reading St. Ignatius of Antioch, and they're like, St. Ignatius of Antioch, he knew the Byzantine liturgy like the back of his
Yeah.
hand. Like, I actually encountered, like, obviously those are not the people I'm going to choose as being representative of Orthodoxy. I'm just talking about people I met who
Actually
would
pretty
make these
common.
claims. Yeah. And
Yeah.
because, I mean, that's kind of what that implies. If you say that we're the absolutely unchanging church, you kind of are implying that, yeah, like all these like vestments in this grand liturgy, like that itself is what goes back to the apostles. And certainly there's a lot of like Byzantine kind of the hymnography, hagiographical tradition can sometimes say things that imply stuff like that. Though obviously I would think that that would be more nuanced. But yeah, I would say when I took that claim more seriously, I obviously predicated it of doctrine. Like, being
Mhm.
more intellectual, I recognize like I can't, like, it doesn't even make sense to say that the liturgy
Right.
and all these practices are unchanged since the beginning, because that would imply that like the Holy Spirit bore no fruit. Like if we actually believe that the Holy Spirit is acting throughout history and that there are people who came after the apostles and Christ himself says that you shall do greater things than I did, I would expect actually like greater things to come about over time. Like I would expect the church to actually make development, to make, as St. Vincent of Lorraine says, progress in doctrine. Like
Mhm.
I would actually expect there to be this progress. I wouldn't expect us to just pick some arbitrary point in church history and decide, all right, today we're gonna be stuck in this point in history. From and something that I noticed though as I was becoming Catholic is that every group that broke off from the Catholic Church has just kind of been forever fixed in the era in which they broke off. And then what they've done is they've confused that time period with apostolic times simply because it's still ancient by modern standards. So, for example, the Oriental Orthodox, like if you look at Oriental Orthodox apologetics, which seems to be kind of having a rise in the past just several months, if not year, I don't follow it too closely. Um, but like seeing how they're arguing for their church, I mean, they're kind of acting like it's the fifth century again. Like we're like debate, like we're
Mhm.
seriously debating these Christological disputes that were settled like over 1,000 years ago. Like they're stuck in the
Right.
fifth century, right? Like we're just like, oh, it's all about Saint Cyril and the Council of Ephesus, which we can talk about that in our ecumenical dialogue. I think that's important. But to act like discerning the true church comes down to like figuring out some canonical dispute from the 5th century that we only have fragmentary evidence of, you know, it's kind of ludicrous to me. And yet the people who break off from the Catholic Church because they don't have that a priori principle, the papacy, they kind of have to do that, right? Same with the Orthodox, right? When they say they're unchanged, perhaps that's true, unchanged since the Middle Ages, right? Which is the time period in which they broke off from the Catholic Church. But if you look at like Orthodox theology, like anything that isn't explicitly said by like a medieval or pre-medieval Orthodox theologian or saint, it's all tentative. Like that's the realm of theological opinion in the mind of many Eastern Orthodox, is anything that hasn't been said by medieval or pre-medieval Orthodox. Like there seems to be the mindset that all of the definitive doctrinal resolutions happen in the past, and everything that comes afterwards, we're just kind of forever stuck in this cycle of we don't really know. Even if that dispute actually was settled in the past, as was the case with rebaptism. I mean, this is an issue. It was settled in the 3rd century. St. Vincent of Lérins in the 6th century. That is what he cites as an example of a matter that was at one time under dispute and since came to be resolved. And the Orthodox are still stuck in the cycle of not knowing whether or not it's actually a resolved issue. So when you say unchanged, I mean that's an example. You know, unchanged since the 3rd century. We're still confused about rebaptism. You know, like that's not a great look. Like something that St. Francis de Sales, he makes this argument against the Protestants, because the Protestants, you know, they point to the Deuterocanon. They say, look, the church at one point didn't consider the Deuterocanon, you know, absolutely to be part of the canon. It was disputed, right? Same with certain books of the New Testament as well, right? This is why Luther famously relegates the Epistle of James to a secondary status, is because James, Hebrews, Revelation, these were all kind of like, for Luther, they were like the Deuterocanon. They were disputed. And so for him, if there was ever a dispute in church history, right, it simply could not be resolved. The church is forever stuck with that dispute. And that's kind of how the Orthodox are, is that what they mistake as being unchanged is really just them being stuck with all these ancient disputes and being incapable of resolving them, right? So St. Francis is going to say, like, yeah, the church at one time had a dispute about the canon, but then we came to a resolution because Christ in Matthew 18, he told us what to do if we have a dispute. He says, try to work it out amongst yourselves. And if you can't work it out, then take it to the church. And whoever does not listen to the church, let him be to you as a heathen and a publican, right? So Christ himself already accounted for the fact that we're going to have diverging opinions and stuff, right? So it's not surprising to look back in church history and see people with different opinions. But when push comes to shove, you're going to take it to the church. You're going to receive a definitive judgment, and everyone who does not listen to it, let him be to you as a heathen and a tax collector, right? And that's what we don't see in the Orthodox Church. So that is what I would say is truly like what it means to be unchanged in the proper sense, would be, do you have actually the same institution that Christ created in the first millennium with the same powers, the same ability, and also has this institution been clearly led beyond just some arbitrary point in the past, but is it still actively being led even in the present day? And that is the kind of continuity that I don't see in Orthodoxy. So while it's true that if you walk into like an Orthodox parish, or even an Oriental Orthodox parish for that matter, you're going to probably see a more ancient liturgy than if you walked into the average Novus Ordo parish, right? That much is true, but that really doesn't tell you a whole lot, other than, you know, that was the era in which those churches broke off from the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church, you know, was not stuck, and so the Catholic Church just kind of kept going. So that's kind of what I have to say about that.
Yeah, and they're really proud of the fact that they're actually stuck and they're in a fixed frozen state, as I think it was Pope Benedict the 16th, if I'm not mistaken. It was one of the Pope Benedicts where he comments on the Eastern churches and he says, you know, they are faithful to the tradition of that time period, but they are petrified as if it were, you know, if they were stuck in that year, whatever it was when they broke off. And they champion this quote from him. They think it's like such an honor, but he's honestly, it's honestly an insult. He's saying like, you're stuck in that period and you haven't moved on. You don't have a living tradition. And I don't know if you've heard this joke before that they like to say. They say, how many bishops does it take to change a light bulb? Have you heard that one?
I have not heard this, no.
And the answer is
No.
change. Like that's the answer. Like
Oh,
change question mark.
okay. I think I've heard this. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so they're really proud of the fact that they're not that they're fixed, that they're petrified, that they're frozen, that they can't
Yeah.
move past and have this continuity. You know, when I saw a meme that was being shared a while back, it was showing pictures of churches, and it said, I don't remember exactly how it was formatted, but it said like the Eastern Orthodox Church and then the ancient church of the first millennium or whatever, and it's like the same. It's like the same interior, everything, and then and then the Protestant church, and it's like super goofy, and then and then it has the ancient church, and then but the ancient Eastern Orthodox Church with like icons and stuff. And then it has the
Yeah.
Catholic Church, and it shows just like a regular Catholic church today. And then it shows an Eastern Orthodox Church. And I was like, why did they put an Eastern Orthodox Church? Because I started to realize one of my observations is that Orthodox often think that everybody was Eastern, that the Eastern
Mm.
Rite was universal, that everybody celebrated the St. John Chrysostom Divine Liturgy. And I started encountering this. People actually think everybody had icons, that, you know, if you don't have icons, it's because you've embraced iconoclasm. The reason that the Catholic Church today has statues is because they've embraced iconoclasm. I'm like, hold on, like, you guys don't understand. Every region, every church has its own flavor, its own expression, its own customs, its own liturgies. The Oriental Orthodox, they have iconography, but it's not like yours. They don't have iconographic practices, iconodualism, like how you guys do. They don't do these things. Did you ever run into that, like with the Orthodox, that they just kind of assumed everything was Eastern?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think there's almost a bit of a paradox because that definitely is like the working assumption at some level. However, like kind of concurrent with that, there is the idea that even before the schism, the Western tradition had already gone astray, right?
Mhm.
And like they usually trace this back to like Saint Augustine, right? And so basically, I wouldn't say I encountered so much people think like just not being aware of the fact that there were like other rites and stuff, but more so being aware of the fact that like Western Christianity existed before the schism, but just believing that Western Christianity had been kind of heretical since its inception. Aside from maybe like a few pockets out in the British Isles that were like really Orthodox until the Norman invasion or, you know, some crazy conspiracy theories like this. Um, but that's more so what I encountered, and that was actually kind of personal to me because obviously I came into the Orthodox Church largely because of Saint Thomas Aquinas, and so I kind of had this general kind of like filial devotion to Saint Thomas, though I didn't, I respected the Orthodox practice. I didn't pray to him while I was Orthodox. I was tried to be consistent with my worldview,
Right.
but I always kind of had a deference towards Saint Thomas. Like if I had a theological question, I would be like, oh, I wonder if Saint Thomas said anything about this, and I would like generally take his views as like being very authoritative. And I kind of developed, and obviously you can't read St. Thomas without having St. Augustine in the back of your mind as well. And so I kind of developed like a love for Western theology. And I always like, because something I noticed is like, you know, the Eastern tradition tends to like criticize the Western tradition for being very highly developed. And they call these like deviations. But something I noticed is that like the Eastern tradition actually has a lot of the same things that like they consider like modern innovations. They actually believe that. They believe the exact same thing. They just haven't thought about it as deeply, and so they can't
Right.
articulate it precisely as the Catholics can. And so then when they see a precise articulation of what they already in fact believe, they say that's a modern innovation. This is the most clear with something like salvation outside the church. Like they'll criticize Lumen Gentium all day long, but then if you actually ask an Orthodox priest, well, so then do you believe only Orthodox Christians can be saved? They're like, oh, you know, you'll get this whole. It's like, I'm sorry, did you just repeat what Lumen Gentium said in less precise terms? I think that's what you just did.
Yeah.
And it's like Lumen Gentium kind of like systematizes things that many Orthodox theologians have already said, especially someone like Father Dimitris Daniloi, basically professes the exact same thing that Lumen Gentium is, just in less precise terms. And so I found that to be the case across the board.
Yeah, even with like
And
transubstantiation, I found that to be the case. I'm like,
Yes,
every Orthodox Christian believes in transubstantiation. They just don't want to say it. They don't want, which is fine. Like if you don't want to use the Aristotelian precise language with the that's perfectly fine if you don't want to say it, but you can't deny it. Like you can't say
right.
transubstantiation is a heresy or a deviation. Like no, you believe in transubstantiation. It's fine if you don't want to use the term, but you 100% believe in it. And if you don't, that's a heresy.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because sometimes they'll say like, you know, the Western error is precisely in trying to be precise, whereas the Eastern has always been more mystical. It's like, I'm sorry, have you ever read the ecumenical councils? Did you read some of these Christological disputes between Saint Cyril and Nestorius? It's the most precise technical thing I've ever read in my life. Like the Eastern tradition was all about theological precision during the time of the seven ecumenical councils. Like anyone who's read the theological sources will know this. Like someone like St. Cyril of Alexandria absolutely cared about theological precision when it came to the deity and the nature of Christ. And so you would want to ask the question, why would the nature of Christ be any less important than the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist? Right?
Right.
Why is one like, I mean, it's the same Christ we're talking about. So why is one given all this theological precision and that's okay, but the other, it's okay if we're just like mystical woo woo and like we just are not going to define anything about this ever. It's very inconsistent
Yeah.
reasoning, and so I kind of just over time developed this sense of like I think the Western tradition is actually very has very much benefited from all of these things that are being denounced as problematic and innovations, and the Eastern tradition actually has been deprived of like theological development. And so part of my project in the Orthodox Church was actually to try and like bring in some of the insights from Western theology into Orthodoxy, which I'm definitely not the first person to do that. In fact,
Right.
every major development that's happened in Orthodox theology, like since the Middle Ages, has been as a direct result of Western influence. Whether it was the Jesuits' presence in the Academy of Kiev, or even like the modern, like the influence of Western scholarship on the 20th century Orthodox theologians, like the neo-patristic synthesis guys. The Orthodox have never like had their own original developments, and I came to see that as a real weakness. And every time I tried to participate in that project of almost like westernizing Eastern theology, but in a positive way from my perspective, I was accused of being a Latinizer. I was
Yep.
told to like, just go become Catholic, which, to be fair, true. I was a Latinizer, and I think that people who fall into that Latinizing camp, they're seeing the things that we're talking about. Of course, I think they mistakenly believe that they can pursue that in the Orthodox Church. I think what that's ultimately a symptom of an underlying problem, which is that the reason that you encounter that problem as a Latinizer in the Orthodox Church is because you feel that impulse towards Catholic unity. You see the wholeness in the Catholic faith, and yet you're trying to embrace that Catholicity outside of the Catholic Church. And that's why you're running into all these problems.
Mm. Yeah. A couple more questions, and then have to let you go. But
Yeah.
when you were in the Orthodox Church, it sounds like you also encountered what I had encountered, where I think it was coming from a good place, but ultimately it ended up coming off as pretty dismissive, where it's like you're trying to figure out all this historical facts, what council said what teaching is continuous with the early church. And I was met with like almost with like a dismissive tone, like, Jonathan, just enjoy the liturgy, like just go deeper into your prayer, like all of this stuff, like don't even try to figure it out, like just be swept away by the divine liturgy, like that's the pinnacle of the spiritual life. To know God is to know Him through prayer. It's not to accumulate all these facts and details. So yeah, just like it almost sounded like turn your brain off and just go pray, and don't even think about what led to the schism or why the Catholic Church is not united to the Orthodox Church. But it's funny because if you ask them, hey, if I were to go to like the true Orthodox or the genuine Orthodox Church, why can't I just go over there? Oh no, you have to, bro, you have to do the history. You have to look at the councils. You have to look at when they split. It's like, wait a minute, this is a double standard. Like you told me not to do that with the Catholics, but when it comes to the true Orthodox or the genuine Orthodox, all of a sudden now I have to do my research. Now I have to look at the history. Because if I were to walk into a genuine Orthodox church, it's going to be the same exact liturgy, the same exact prayer life, the same exact saints, the same exact councils. So, how what's the symmetry breaker? How am I going to distinguish between that church and your church? Well, the answer is I have to do my research. I have to see when this schism took place or when this rupture took place. But I don't know. Did you encounter that type of behavior?
Oh yeah, I would say that was probably like the main thing that was told to me, like what in like my parish, like from my parish priest, that was kind of his main line. Which obviously the people who are more intellectual, like that's not going to cut it, obviously, because it's exactly like you said. It's like, I mean, here's why I think you see that line show up in so many different people, because I think there's some truth that is trying to be communicated, which is that you can't be so intellectual that you neglect the spiritual. Right. I
Mm,
think that is the truth that is
right.
trying to be communicated by people who say that is like they basically, because like from their perspective, someone who's convinced Eastern Orthodox, like what's happening is like this person, they're reading all this stuff online, and they're not being truly led by God. They're being led by their mind. And so they're going to like walk right out the church door because, they let their mind go astray. And so what they want to make sure is that you're not being led by your mind. Because like I said, like when I was talking about, the advice I gave to people who are considering becoming Catholic from Eastern Orthodoxy is like, don't make that decision in a spiritually desolate place. Like, even if like, you have the intellect is all fully there. Like, I mean, if you are like spiritually desolate, and like you can't actually think clearly about what you're doing, that can sometimes be even a more dangerous decision, right? Because, then you'll make the decision and then you're going to question it because you'll be like, well, hold on, I wasn't in a great place spiritually. There's all these other things. And then the cycle will repeat, right? So that's why it's very important, because the idea is not just to like get people to convert, it's to get people to convert to stay, right? That's actually why, like, when people talk about the surge of converts to Eastern Orthodoxy, I'm like, let's wait like 15 to 20 years and then see to what extent that actually is a good thing or not, right? Because it's not just about getting people across, getting the chrism oil on their head. It's about making disciples of Christ for life. Right. That's why I think we, ultimately, like, what I would love to see is more interviews with people who have like been, Catholic for like 20, 30, 40 years. See, like, how did you stay? Not just how did you become Catholic? How did you stay Catholic? How did you stay in the faith? And so I think that's the spiritual, that's like the truth that's trying to be communicated through that. Obviously, as you mentioned, where it's deficient is because if you're just in the mindset of like, oh, just attend the liturgy, tune out your brain, just focus on prayer, don't think about these things at all. Well, first of all, if you don't think about things at all, how do you know that your prayer life is rational and coherent, right? Because you need to know what you're doing in prayer, because prayer is, ultimately a submission, about submitting the will to the intellect, right? It's about finding God, because what is union with God? Like, where does union with God take place? God is not like some substance that I like, like material substance that I just grab and I like pour on myself and like, oh, I'm united to God now. Like, no. Union with God happens in the will. And the will, specifically when it's submitting itself to the intellect. So the intellect has to be properly formed in order to submit to the will. This is, in fact, how we mirror the Trinity. The image of God is within us, right? That the intellect corresponding to the Son, right? This is why we appropriate the virtue of faith to the divine Son, right? And the act of the will corresponding to the Holy Spirit, which is why we appropriate love to the Holy Spirit, right? And so the entire spiritual life is about the interrelation between the intellect and the will. And so if you don't have an intellectual formation, then your spiritual life itself is going to be completely derailed. So I think you're definitely right, because, yeah, you could bring up that point of, I'm sure, an Eastern Orthodox person could say that, an Oriental Orthodox person could say that, a true Orthodox person could say that, someone in the Assyrian Church of the East could say that. I mean, to be honest, like, a Muslim could say that. To somebody who's like considering leaving Islam, who's like, I've found all these videos critiquing the Quran, and they're like, oh, just pray, just read the Quran and pray the surah, and don't worry about it too much. It's like, no, like, sometimes, at least for those who are outside the Catholic Church, like, that is a tugging of the Holy Spirit of like, hey, I'm pulling you in this direction, and you have to be open to hear the voice of the Spirit. And he does, in fact, he doesn't just speak, spiritually through prayer, though he does. But he can also speak intellectually through things that we read through our study. This is why I love the Dominican charism, which is about uniting the life of prayer with the life of study. So I'd encourage people, look into the Dominicans, look into Dominican spirituality, because they very much hammer out the distinction between the intellectual and the spiritual life, and how those are ultimately supposed to come together to produce the contemplative life, right? That it's not, those things are not opposed, they're working together to produce our final end, which is union with God.
I love that. Well, Ben, I'm going to have to let you go. I could do this for a couple more hours, but